The crystal mines of Zareth 7 glowed with an eerie blue light that never faded even in the deepest shafts where the air grew thin and the temperature dropped below freezing, and Kelly had been working in these mines for 3 years now with heavy chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles that left permanent scars on her pale skin. She was an elf from the forest world of Lumina, and her people were known across the galaxy for their connection to nature and their ability to bond with creatures that others feared. But none of that mattered here in the Draknor Empire, where she was just another slave with a number tattooed on her neck and a daily quota of crystals to mine or face punishment. The Draknor were a brutal race of reptilian warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds and enslaved millions of beings, and their empire stretched across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy, and they showed no mercy to those who resisted them. And Kelly had learned that lesson the hard way when she tried to escape during her first month and spent 2 weeks in the punishment cells with no food or water. But Kelly had not given up hope because she had a secret that even the Draknor guards did not know about, and that secret lived in her cell hidden beneath a loose floor panel where she had carved out a small space over many months of careful work. 2 dragon eggs had been her discovery 6 months ago, when she was working in the deepest part of Shaft 49, and she found them, abandoned in a collapsed tunnel that the Draknor had sealed off decades before, and she smuggled them back to her cell piece by piece, hidden in her work boots and under her clothes. The eggs hatched 2 months later, and Kelly named the dragons Ash and Ember because one had scales the color of dark smoke and the other had scales that glowed like hot coals in firelight, and they were tiny things no bigger than her hand, but they recognized her as their mother from the moment they opened their eyes. Kelly fed them scraps of her already meager meals and gave them water from her daily ration, and she sang to them in the old language of her people, the songs that her grandmother had taught her before the Draknor came and destroyed everything she loved. The dragons grew quickly, but they seemed to understand the danger they were in, and they stayed small and quiet during the day when the guards made their rounds, and only at night when Kelly returned from the mines would they emerge from their hiding place and curl up against her chest seeking warmth and comfort. Ash was clever and cautious, always watching the door with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any creature his size should, and Ember was brave and fierce and would hiss at the shadows on the wall as if challenging them to come closer. Kelly taught them simple commands in Elvish, and they learned to obey her whispers and hand signals, and she showed them how to hide when danger approached and how to stay perfectly still even when their instincts told them to run. Life in the mines was brutal, and every day, Kelly saw slaves collapse from exhaustion or succumb to the toxic gases that leaked from the deeper shafts, and the Draknor guards would simply drag their bodies away and throw them in the furnaces that powered the colony, and no one ever spoke their names again. But Kelly endured because she had Ash and Ember to care for, and because deep in her heart she believed that one day she would find a way to escape this place and return to whatever remained of her homeworld, and take her dragons with her to live free under open skies. The other slaves whispered about her, sometimes calling her the Silent One because she rarely spoke except to answer the guards, and she kept to herself during the brief rest periods when they were allowed to gather in the common area. There was an old human named Frank who worked in the same shaft as Kelly, and he had been a prisoner for 15 years. And he told her stories about the world beyond the mines, about the human alliance that was fighting against the Draknor Empire, and about the rumor that they were developing new weapons that could finally turn the tide of the war. Kelly listened to these stories with hunger in her heart, because they gave her something to hope for even if that hope seemed impossible. And Frank seemed to understand her need for these tales, and he shared them freely, even when the guards told him to be quiet. One evening, Frank pulled Kelly aside after their shift and told her in a hushed voice that something big was going to happen soon, and he had overheard the guards talking about increased security measures and about important prisoners being transferred to the colony. Kelly asked what kind of prisoners, but Frank did not know, and he only warned her to be careful and to keep her head down, because when the Draknor got nervous, they tended to take their anxiety out on the slaves. That night, Kelly held Ash and Ember close and whispered to them about freedom, and about the forests of Lumina where dragons once flew freely through the canopy and hunted in the clear streams, and she promised them that someday they would see those places, even if she had no idea how she would keep that promise. The next morning, the alarms started blaring through the entire colony, and red emergency lights flooded every tunnel and corridor, and the guards came running through the barracks shouting orders and hitting anyone who did not move fast enough with their shock sticks. Kelly was pulled from her cell along with dozens of other slaves, and they were herded into the main assembly area, where Commander Vex stood on a raised platform with his elite guard surrounding him. Vex was a massive Drachnor, with dark green scales and yellow eyes that seemed to glow with malice, and he was known throughout the colony as the most brutal of all the commanders, and slaves who displeased him rarely survived their punishment. He announced that a rebel ship had been shot down near the northern ridge, and that all slaves were to return to their cells immediately and remain there until further notice, and anyone found outside their designated area would be executed without trial. The slaves shuffled back to their cells in frightened silence, and Kelly felt her heart pounding because she knew that something significant was happening, and that the Drachnor were worried about something they could not control back in her cell. Kelly waited until the guards passed by, and then she carefully lifted the floor panel and brought out Ash and Ember, who seemed to sense her anxiety and pressed close to her sides. She sat on her thin mattress and tried to think about what Frank had said and about the rebel ship that had crashed, and she wondered if this might be the opportunity she had been waiting for all these years. Hours passed, and the colony remained on high alert, with guards patrolling constantly, and the sound of their heavy boots echoing through the corridors, and Kelly could hear the distant hum of search vehicles launching from the hangar bay, going out to search the wastelands for survivors from the crashed ship. As night fell, Kelly made a decision that would change everything, and she whispered to Ash and Ember that they needed to be ready because tomorrow they might finally have their chance at freedom. And the dragons seemed to understand because they both chirped softly and their eyes glowed brighter in the darkness. Kelly did not sleep that night because she spent the hours planning and thinking about every detail of the mine layout and every guard rotation schedule that she had memorized over 3 years. And she knew that if she was going to make a move, she would need to be perfect because there would be no second chances. The next morning came with more alarms and more chaos, and Kelly heard the guards shouting about a missing prisoner and about search parties being organized, and she knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for. She waited until the midday shift change when the guards were distracted and tired, and then she called Ash and Ember to her and told them it was time to go, and the little dragons climbed onto her shoulders and tucked themselves under her hair and collar, where they would not be seen. Kelly walked calmly out of her cell like she was going to her shift, and she moved through the corridors with confidence, because she knew that slaves who looked like they belonged were rarely questioned, and she made her way toward the northern access tunnels that led to the surface. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady, and she thought about Frank and about all the other slaves who would never have this chance, and she promised herself that if she made it out alive, she would come back for them someday and free them all. The tunnel entrance was ahead, and Kelly could see the faint glow of daylight coming from the surface, and she took a deep breath and kept walking toward that light with Ash and Ember pressed against her skin and freedom, waiting just beyond the darkness. Kelly emerged from the tunnel into the harsh daylight of Zareth 7, and the twin suns burned down on the barren landscape, making the air shimmer with heat, and she had to shield her eyes against the brightness because she had not seen real sunlight in over 3 years. The surface was a wasteland of red rocks and gray sand stretching in every direction, with no vegetation and no water, and the only structures visible were the guard towers that dotted the perimeter of the mining colony, and the massive processing facilities that turned raw crystals into weapons for the Drachnor war machine. Kelly stayed low behind a cluster of boulders and scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of the crashed ship or the search parties, and she could see smoke rising in the distance toward the northern ridge, and she knew that was where she needed to go. Ash and Ember climbed out from under her collar and stretched their wings, which had grown longer in recent weeks, and they chirped quietly as if asking what they should do next, and Kelly whispered for them to stay close and to remain silent because any noise could give away their position. She moved carefully from rock to rock, using every bit of cover available, and her years of working in the mines had made her strong despite the poor food and harsh conditions, and she climbed over the rough terrain with surprising speed. The search parties were visible now as dark shapes moving across the landscape in organized patterns, and Kelly could hear the distant whine of hover vehicles and the occasional shout of commands being given, and she knew she had to reach the crash site before the Drachnor found whoever had survived. As she got closer to the ridge, Kelly saw the wreckage of what had once been a small, elegant ship, unlike the brutal, angular designs of Drachnor vessels, and parts of it were scattered across a wide area, and the main hull was embedded in the side of a rocky outcrop with smoke still pouring from its engines. Kelly approached cautiously, looking for any signs of life and listening for the sounds of guards who might have already secured the area. And Ash and Ember stayed on her shoulders, their small bodies tense and alert. Then she heard it, a soft sound like someone crying or trying to catch their breath, and it was coming from behind a fallen piece of the ship's wing. And Kelly moved closer with her heart pounding and her hands ready to defend herself if necessary. Behind the wreckage, she found a young woman with blue skin and silver hair that seemed to shimmer like starlight, and she was wearing torn robes that had once been elegant and royal-looking, and she was clutching something small and metallic to her chest like her life depended on it. The woman looked up at Kelly with eyes that were the color of deep space, filled with swirling galaxies and fear and hope mixed together, and she tried to speak, but her voice came out broken and weak. Kelly knelt down beside her and spoke softly in common, tongue telling her that she was not with the Draknor and that she wanted to help, and the woman studied her face for a long moment before seeming to make a decision. She introduced herself as Princess Lyra of the Celestian Throne, and she explained that she had been fleeing from Draknor assassins who had attacked her diplomatic convoy and killed her guards, and she had barely escaped in this emergency pod before they destroyed her. Ship Kelly noticed the chains still hanging from her own wrists, and she saw recognition in Lyra's eyes as the princess understood that Kelly was also a prisoner, and that they were both running from the same enemy. Lyra held up the small metallic object which Kelly now saw was a data chip, and the princess explained, in halting common tongue, that this chip contained proof of the Draknor Emperor's secret plans, and that he was building a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems, and that she needed to get this information to the Human Alliance before it was too late. Kelly felt the weight of what Lyra was telling her, and she understood that this was bigger than just her own escape, and bigger than the freedom of one princess, and this was about the survival of billions of people across the galaxy. She told Lyra that she would help her get off this planet, but they needed to move immediately because the search parties were getting closer, and they needed to find shelter and a way to contact the Alliance. Lyra tried to stand but collapsed from pain, and Kelly saw that her leg was badly injured, probably broken, and there was no way she could walk on her own across the rough terrain. Kelly made a quick decision, and she told Ash and Ember to reveal themselves, and the two dragons dropped from her shoulders and landed on the ground, and then something amazing happened. The dragons began to grow larger right before their eyes, their scales glowing with an inner light, and within seconds they were the size of large dogs, and then the size of ponies, and Lyra gasped in amazement and fear. Kelly explained that dragons had the ability to change their size when needed, and that they had been staying small to hide from the guards. But now they needed to be strong, and the dragons seemed to understand, because they positioned themselves next to Lyra. Kelly helped the princess onto Ash's back, and the dragon stood steady and calm, accepting the weight without complaint, and Ember took position beside them, ready to defend against any threat. They moved away from the crash site, heading toward a series of caves that Kelly had seen on her work assignments when she used to transport crystals to the surface processing stations, and she knew those caves would provide shelter and give them time to plan their next move. The sound of hover vehicles grew louder, and Kelly pushed them to move faster, even though Lyra was clearly in pain and trying not to cry out every time Ash had to climb over rough ground. They reached the caves just as the first search party arrived at the crash site, and Kelly led them deep into the darkness where the Draknor sensors would have difficulty detecting their heat signatures because the caves were filled with crystal deposits that interfered with scanning equipment inside the cave. Kelly carefully helped Lyra down from Ash's back and examined her injured leg, and she used strips torn from her own clothing to create a makeshift splint, and Lyra bit her lip to keep from screaming as Kelly set the bone ember, and Ash shrank back down to their smaller size to conserve energy, and they curled up near Lyra, providing warmth in the cold cave, and the princess stroked their scales with wonder in her eyes. Kelly asked Lyra about the data chip, and the princess explained that she had been working undercover for months gathering intelligence on the Draknor weapon project, and that she had finally obtained the complete specifications and timeline for when the weapon would be deployed. The weapon was called the Star Eater, and it used ancient dark matter technology that the Draknor had discovered on a dead world, and it could create artificial black holes that would consume entire solar systems and leave nothing behind. Lyra said that the weapon was nearly complete, and that the Emperor planned to use it first on Earth as a demonstration of his power and to force the human alliance to surrender, and then he would use it to subjugate every remaining free world in the galaxy. Kelly felt sick thinking about Earth and all the humans she had met in the mines, including Frank, who talked about his home in a place called Colorado, and about mountains covered with snow and rivers full of fish. She told Lyra that they needed to find a way off this planet immediately, and that they needed to get to the nearest Alliance outpost, which, according to Frank, was 3 systems away at a place called Firebase. Delta Lyra nodded and pulled out a small emergency beacon from her robes, and she said that if they could get far enough away from the Draknor jammers, she could activate it and send a distress signal, but they would need to get at least 50 kilometers from the colony to be outside the jamming field. Kelly knew there was only one way to cover that much distance quickly, and that was to steal a ship from the colony transport depot, and she had worked on those ships before doing maintenance when the regular mechanics were unavailable, and she knew how to bypass their security system. She explained her plan to Lyra, and the princess looked doubtful but nodded because there were no other options, and they both knew that staying in the caves was only a temporary solution. As night fell over Zareth 7, Kelly prepared to make the most dangerous move of her life, and she gathered Ash and Ember close and told them that tomorrow they would either be free or they would be dead, but they would not be slaves anymore. Lyra placed her hand on Kelly's arm and thanked her for helping a stranger, and Kelly smiled for the first time in years and said that they were not strangers anymore, because they were sisters in survival, and that was a bond stronger than chains or empires. The 2 women and 2 dragons settled in for a few hours of rest, knowing that the next day would determine the fate of not just their own lives, but potentially the lives of everyone in the galaxy. Kelly woke before dawn to the sound of distant explosions, and she sat up quickly with her heart racing, and Ash and Ember were already alert with their scales glowing softly in the darkness of the cave, and Lyra was awake too with pain etched on her blue face. The explosions continued, and Kelly crawled to the cave entrance and looked out across the wasteland toward the mining colony, and she could see fires burning and smoke rising into the purple sky, and the sound of weapons fire echoed across the rocks. Lyra dragged herself to Kelly's side despite her broken leg, and together they watched as the colony descended into chaos, and Lyra whispered that perhaps the Alliance had launched an attack to recover her, or maybe there was a slave uprising. Kelly knew it was neither because she recognized the pattern of destruction, and this was the Draknor purging suspected rebels or collaborators from their own ranks, and she had seen it happen twice before during her captivity when the Emperor suspected betrayal among his commanders. She told Lyra that this actually helped them, because in the confusion and panic, the guards would be focused on internal threats rather than searching for escaped prisoners, and this might be their best chance to reach the transport depot. Lyra agreed, and she pulled out the data chip and made Kelly promise that if anything happened to her, Kelly would get the information to the Alliance no matter what, and Kelly took the chip and secured it in a hidden pocket she had sewn into the lining of her work clothes. They waited until the explosions stopped and the chaos reached its peak, and then Kelly helped Lyra onto Ash's back again, and the dragon grew to his larger size, and they emerged from the cave into the smoky morning air. The landscape was even more dangerous now, with Draknor patrols moving erratically and the sound of combat coming from multiple directions, and Kelly led them on a winding path that took advantage of every depression and rock formation. They passed the bodies of slaves who had been caught in the crossfire, and Kelly recognized some of them, including a young woman named Maria, who had only arrived at the colony 3 months ago, and Kelly felt anger burning in her chest like embers fire. The transport depot was on the far side of the colony, and to reach it they would need to pass through the industrial sector, where the processing facilities turned crystals into weapons and where the security was usually heaviest. Kelly paused at the edge of the industrial sector and studied the guard patterns, and she noticed that many of the usual checkpoints were abandoned, and that the guards who remained seemed more interested in protecting themselves than following standard protocols. She signaled for Ash and Ember to stay low, and they moved quickly through the maze of pipes and machinery and the smell of chemicals and burning metal was overwhelming, and Kelly had to cover her mouth to keep from coughing. They were halfway through when they heard voices ahead, and Kelly froze and pressed herself against a massive coolant tank, and Ash crouched down with Lyra still on his back, and Ember positioned himself to attack if necessary. 3. Draknar guards came around the corner arguing loudly about whether they should retreat to their ship or stay and follow orders, and they were not paying attention to their surroundings, and they walked right past Kelly's hiding spot without seeing her. As soon as they were gone, Kelly continued forward with her hands shaking from adrenaline and fear, and she could see the transport depot ahead with its massive hangar doors standing open. Inside the depot there were dozens of ships of various sizes and designs, and most of them were cargo vessels used to transport crystals to other worlds. But Kelly spotted what she was looking for: a small, fast courier ship that the commanders use for urgent messages and personal travel. The problem was that there were still guards in the depot, and they were loading equipment onto the larger ships, apparently preparing for evacuation. And Kelly counted at least 8 guards between them and the courier ship. Lyra whispered that they should wait for a better opportunity. But Kelly shook her head because there would be no better opportunity, and every minute they waited increased the chance of discovery. Kelly told Lyra her plan, and the princess looked shocked and tried to argue. But Kelly was firm, and she said this was the only way, and that Lyra needed to trust her and trust the dragons. She moved to a control panel on the wall and used skills she had learned from watching mechanics work, and she accessed the depot's system and triggered a fire alarm in the far corner of the hangar. Immediately the guards responded, running toward the alarm with their weapons ready and leaving the courier ship temporarily unguarded, and Kelly sprinted across the open space with Ash carrying Lyra and Ember flying overhead. They reached the ship, and Kelly began working on the access panel, while Ash and Ember stood guard, and her fingers moved quickly through the override sequence, and she heard the lock disengage with a satisfying click. The ship's door opened, and Kelly helped Lyra inside, and then called for Ash and Ember, who shrank down to their smaller size and darted into the cargo hold, just as the guards realized the fire alarm was false and started returning to their posts. Kelly sealed the door and ran to the cockpit and slid into the pilot's seat, and her hands moved over the controls, bringing the engines online, and she could hear shouting outside and the sound of weapons being aimed at the ship. The engines roared to life, and Kelly pushed the throttle forward, and the ship lurched upward, and plasma bolts flashed past the windows as the guards opened fire, and the ship's shields flickered under the assault. Kelly pulled hard on the controls, and the ship shot through the open hangar doors and into the open sky, and alarms were blaring, and she could see pursuit ships launching from other hangars. But the courier ship was fast and nimble. Lyra pulled herself into the co-pilot seat despite her injured leg, and she began working the navigation system and calling up star charts, and Kelly focused on flying evasively to avoid the weapons fire that chased them into the upper atmosphere. They broke through into space, and Kelly saw the vast darkness filled with stars and 3 Draknar warships in orbit around Zareth 7, and their weapons were already tracking the stolen courier. Ship Kelly pushed the engines to maximum and flew directly toward the largest warship, which was not what the Draknar expected, and at the last second she veered hard to port and passed underneath the warship's shields, where their weapons could not target without hitting their own ship. Lyra was working frantically at the navigation console, and she shouted coordinates for a jump point that would take them toward Firebase Delta, and Kelly adjusted course and aimed for those coordinates while dodging fire from the other 2 warships. The ship shook violently as a plasma bolt clipped their port wing, and warning lights flashed across every panel, and Kelly could smell smoke coming from somewhere behind them. And the engines were making sounds that indicated serious damage. Ash and Ember came forward from the cargo hold, and Ember's eyes were wide with fear. But Ash seemed calm and focused, and Kelly told them both that everything would be okay, even though she was not sure she believed it herself. They reached the jump point, and Lyra activated the hyperdrive, and Kelly prayed that the damaged ship would hold together long enough to complete the jump, and for a moment nothing happened, and the Draknar warships were closing in. Then the stars stretched into lines, and reality bent around them, and they jumped into hyperspace, leaving Zareth 7 behind, and Kelly finally allowed herself to breathe. The ship shuddered and groaned, and smoke was definitely coming from the engine compartment now. and Kelly checked the systems and saw that they had maybe 6 hours of hyperspace travel before the engines failed completely. Lyra calculated that Firebase Delta was 8 hours away at normal speed, but Kelly said they did not have 8 hours, and they would need to drop out of hyperspace early and use emergency thrusters to cover the remaining distance. Kelly sat the ship on autopilot and went back to check on the engine damage, and what she found was worse than she expected because the plasma bolt had ruptured a fuel line and melted part of the hyperdrive motivator, and it was only staying together. Through sheer luck, she returned to the cockpit and told Lyra the situation, and the princess closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language that sounded like a prayer. Kelly asked about the emergency beacon and whether it would reach Firebase Delta from their current position, and Lyra said they were still too far away, but if they could get within 2 systems, she could activate it and hope someone was listening. 5 hours into the journey, the engines began to fail, and Kelly tried to coax more power from them, but they were dying, and she made the decision to drop out of hyperspace while they still had some control. They emerged in a system with a yellow star and 4 planets, and no sign of any Draknor presence, and Kelly used the last of their thruster fuel to put them in orbit around the 3rd planet, which appeared to be uninhabited. Lyra activated the emergency beacon and sent out a distress signal with her royal codes and the data chip's information, and they waited in the silence of the dead ship surrounded by darkness and uncertainty. Ash and Ember curled up on Kelly's lap, and she stroked their scales and told them stories about Lumina, about forests where the trees grew so tall they touched the clouds, and rivers that ran clear and cold from mountain springs. On the 12th hour after sending the distress signal, Kelly saw something on the sensors and her heart leaped with hope and fear, because it could be a rescue ship, or it could be Draknor hunters tracking them down. Lyra pulled herself to the sensor console and studied the readings, and then she smiled for the first time since they escaped, and she said the signature was definitely Human Alliance, and it appeared to be a military patrol vessel. The ship approached slowly and hailed them on standard Alliance frequencies, and a voice came through the speakers asking them to identify themselves and state their situation. Lyra responded with her royal codes and explained that she was Princess Lyra of Celestia, and that she was traveling with a refugee from Draknor captivity, and that they had critical intelligence about an imminent threat to the Alliance. There was a long pause, and Kelly imagined the patrol ship's crew trying to verify Lyra's identity and wondering if this was some kind of Draknor trick, and then the voice returned and said they were sending a shuttle to retrieve them. Kelly felt tears streaming down her face, and she had not cried in 3 years because crying in the mines only brought more pain. But now she could not stop, and Ash and Ember chirped softly and nuzzled against her, trying to comfort their mother. The shuttle docked with their damaged courier ship, and the airlock opened, and 3 human soldiers in Alliance uniforms entered with weapons ready, but not aimed, and their eyes widened when they saw Lyra's blue skin and silver hair. The lead soldier was a woman named Lieutenant Chen, and she had kind eyes, and she immediately called for a medical team when she saw Lyra's broken leg and the burns and bruises that covered both women. They transferred to the shuttle, and Kelly refused to leave without Ash and Ember, and Lieutenant Chen looked skeptical, but Lyra explained that the dragons had saved both their lives multiple times, and Chen finally agreed and said the dragons could come. The patrol ship was called the Horizon's Edge, and it was a destroyer-class vessel with a crew of 200, and the captain was a stern man named Victor Kane, who met them in the medical bay where doctors were treating Lyra's injuries. Kane looked at Kelly with suspicion because she was an elf, and there were rumors that some elves had collaborated with the Draknor in exchange for mercy, and Kelly met his gaze without flinching and showed him her scars and the slave tattoo on her neck. Lyra defended Kelly immediately and told Kane that without her courage and sacrifice they would never have escaped, and the data chip would still be in Draknor hands, and Kane's expression softened and he apologized for his suspicion. Lyra handed the data chip to Kane and explained what it contained, and the captain's face went pale as he listened to her description of the Star Eater weapon, and he immediately ordered his communications officer to send an encrypted message to Alliance Command. Kelly was given quarters next to Lyra, and a shower with hot water and clean clothes, and she stood under the water for a long time, watching 3 years of grime and blood wash away, and trying to believe that she was really free. That night, Kelly could not sleep because she kept expecting guards to burst through the door and drag her back to the mines, and Ash and Ember sensed her anxiety, and they grew larger and positioned themselves as guards at her door. Next morning, Kane summoned Kelly and Lyra to a briefing with his senior officers, and he showed them analysis that the ship's computers had done on the data chip information, and the news was even worse than they thought. The Star Eater was not just one weapon but a network of 5 weapons positioned strategically around Alliance space, and they were all scheduled to activate simultaneously in less than 2 weeks. And the target list included Earth and 4 other heavily populated core worlds. Kane said that Alliance Command had ordered the Horizon's Edge to rendezvous with a battle group at Firebase Delta, and that they would coordinate a response. But the challenge was enormous because the weapons were protected by massive fleets and fortifications. Lyra asked if there was any way to disable the weapons before they activated, and Kane said the technical team was studying the specifications, but it appeared the weapons had fail-safes that would trigger automatic detonation if tampered with. Kelly listened to all of this and felt overwhelming despair because she had thought that escaping and delivering the data chip would be enough. But now she realized that the war was far from over, and that billions of lives were still in danger. Over the next 3 days, as the Horizon's Edge traveled to Firebase Delta, Kelly spent time with the ship's engineers, and she discovered she had a natural talent for understanding alien technology because of her work in the mines. She studied the Star Eater specifications and noticed something that the human engineers had missed because they were thinking like humans, and not like someone who had worked with Draknor crystal technology for 3 years. Kelly realized that the weapons were powered by the same crystals she had mined on Zareth 7, and that those crystals were unstable when exposed to certain harmonic frequencies. And she knew this because she had seen cave-ins caused by resonance when mining equipment operated at the wrong frequency. She brought her theory to Kane and his chief engineer, and at first they were skeptical, but Kelly demonstrated her knowledge of crystal harmonics, and they began to listen more carefully. The chief engineer ran simulations based on Kelly's suggestions and discovered that she was right, and if they could generate the correct frequency near the Star Eater weapons, they might be able to destabilize the crystals and cause the weapons to fail without triggering the fail-safes. This discovery changed everything, and Kane immediately transmitted Kelly's findings to Alliance Command along with a recommendation that she be consulted on the mission planning. When they arrived at Firebase Delta, the scale of the Alliance response became clear, and there were over 50 ships gathered, including carriers and battleships and support vessels. And Kelly had never seen so much military power in one place. Admiral Grace Hoffman commanded the battle group, and she was a legendary figure who had won major victories against the Draknor. And when she met Kelly and Lyra, she treated them both with respect and listened carefully to everything they said. Hoffman convened a war council, and Kelly found herself sitting at a table with admirals and generals and elite soldiers, and she was just a former slave with no rank or authority. But they listened to her because she had knowledge that could save billions of lives. The plan that emerged was daring and dangerous, and it required simultaneous strikes on all 5 Star Eater weapons using teams that could plant harmonic generators close enough to destabilize the crystals. And Kelly insisted on being part of the team that would strike the weapon closest to Earth. Hoffman tried to refuse, saying that Kelly had already done enough and that she deserved rest, but Kelly was firm. And she said that she knew the Draknor better than anyone because she had lived as their prisoner, and she knew their weaknesses. Lyra also volunteered, despite her injured leg, which was still healing, and she said her royal status might be useful in negotiations or as a bargaining chip, and Hoffman finally agreed to let them both participate, but assigned them to the support team rather than the assault team. Kelly spent the next week training with the strike team and learning to use Alliance weapons and equipment, and Ash and Ember trained alongside her, and the soldiers were amazed by the dragon's intelligence and abilities. The dragons had grown significantly since leaving Zareth 7, and they were now the size of horses, and they could fly for hours without tiring, and their flames could melt through Draknor armor. And the tactical team began incorporating them into the mission plan. Frank appeared on the 4th day, and Kelly almost did not recognize him because he was clean and healthy and wearing civilian clothes, and he explained that the Alliance had liberated the mining colony during a raid and rescued the surviving slaves. Kelly embraced him and cried again, and Frank told her that her escape had inspired the other slaves, and that when the Alliance arrived, many of the guards surrendered without fighting because they knew the Empire was crumbling. Frank said he wanted to help with the mission, and Admiral Hoffman agreed to let him join the technical support team because he had 40 years of experience with mining equipment and crystal technology. On the final night before the mission, Kelly stood on the observation deck with Lyra, and they looked out at the stars and talked about what would happen after the war was won. Lyra said that Kelly would always have a place on Celestia, and that she would be honored as a hero and given lands and titles. But Kelly said she just wanted to go home to Lumina and see if anything remained of her people. They promised each other that no matter what happened during the mission, they would not let fear control them, and that they would fight for every person who could, not fight for themselves. The next morning, the strike teams boarded their ships and Kelly climbed into the assault transport with Ash and Ember at her side, and her heart was calm, because she knew that this was what she was meant to do. The fleet jumped into hyperspace heading toward their targets, and Kelly closed her eyes and thought about all the slaves still suffering in Draknor mines, and about all the families who would be saved if this mission succeeded, and she was ready to give everything to make that happen. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace in 5 different systems simultaneously, and Kelly's strike team emerged near a massive space station orbiting a gas giant, and the Star Eater weapon was embedded in the center of the station, protected by layers of shields and armored Draknor warships immediately moved to intercept. But the Alliance had planned for this, and capital ships engaged the enemy fleet, while the strike teams made their approach in stealth transports designed to slip through the chaos. Kelly sat in the transport with 20 elite soldiers, and Ash and Ember were compressed into their smallest forms tucked against her chest, and she could feel their hearts beating rapidly with anticipation. Commander Torres led the strike team, and he was a veteran of 30 missions behind enemy lines, and he had personally requested Kelly for this operation. After seeing her tactical analysis of Draknor defense patterns, the transport shook as it passed through the battle, and Kelly could see through the window as Alliance fighters dueled with Draknor interceptors, and a destroyer exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the darkness. They reached the station's outer hull and used magnetic clamps to attach the transport. And then, cutting lasers began carving through the armor, and Kelly checked her equipment one final time, including the harmonic generator that she would need to plant near the weapon's power core. The hull breach opened, and the strike team poured through into a maintenance corridor and immediately came under fire from Draknor security forces, and Kelly stayed behind the soldiers as they returned fire with precision and discipline. Ash and Ember grew to their combat size and charged into the enemy. Line and their flames turned Draknor armor into molten slag, and the soldiers pushed forward, taking advantage of the chaos. The dragons created, Kelly moved with the team deeper into the station, following the path they had memorized from stolen schematics, and every turn brought new resistance, and the sound of weapons fire echoed through the metal corridors. They reached a junction where the path split, and Torres divided the team, sending half to secure their escape route, while he led the others, including Kelly, toward the weapon core, and time was critical because they had less than 30 minutes before the weapon's scheduled activation. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, and Kelly gasped because she could see the Star Eater in all its terrible glory. And it was a sphere of crystallized dark matter suspended in a containment field, and surrounded by processing arrays that hummed with barely contained energy. Draknor technicians scrambled to evacuate, and some tried to fight. But Ash and Ember made short work of them, and Torres ordered his soldiers to secure the perimeter, while Kelly and Frank moved to install the harmonic generator. Kelly worked quickly with Frank assisting and passing her tools, and they positioned the generator according to the calculations Kelly had made, and she activated it and watched as the frequency readings climbed toward the critical threshold. Alarms began blaring throughout the station, and Kelly knew that the Draknor had detected what they were doing, and reinforcements would arrive within minutes, and Torres shouted for them to hurry. The crystals in the Star Eater began to resonate, and Kelly could see fractures forming in the dark matter sphere, and the containment field was starting to fluctuate, and she knew they were close, but they needed more time. Draknor elite guards burst into the chamber, and these were not regular soldiers but warriors in powered armor with weapons that could punch through Alliance shields, and Torres and his team engaged them while Kelly continued working, One of the guards broke through the line and charged toward Kelly with a plasma blade raised, and Ember intercepted him, and the two collided in a fury of flame and metal, and Kelly did not look because she had to trust her dragon and focus on the generator. Frank was hit by weapons fire and he fell beside Kelly with blood spreading across his chest, and Kelly grabbed him and dragged him behind cover, and he looked up at her with pain in his eyes and told her to finish the mission. Kelly felt rage and grief, but she pushed them down, and she increased the generator's output to maximum, even though the safety protocols warned that this could cause a feedback explosion, and she no longer cared about her own safety. The Star Eater's containment field collapsed and the dark matter sphere began to fragment, and the entire station shook as massive amounts of energy were released in uncontrolled bursts, and Torres screamed for everyone to evacuate. Immediately, Kelly picked up Frank and ran toward the exit, and Ash grabbed him gently in his jaws and carried him, while Ember covered their retreat with walls of flame and the strike team fought their way back through corridors that were now collapsing. They reached the transport and piled inside, and Kelly held Frank as the ship detached from the station and accelerated away. And through the window she saw the Star Eater implode, and then explode, and the entire station was consumed in a ball of white light. The transport's pilot pushed the engines beyond their limits, and they barely escaped the blast radius. And Kelly looked down at Frank and saw that he was still breathing, but barely, and she told him he was going to make it. Frank smiled and said he was proud of her, and that she had saved so many lives, and then his eyes closed and Kelly felt his last breath, and she held him close and whispered prayers in Elvish that her grandmother had taught her for honoring the dead. Torres reported that all 5 strike teams had succeeded, and that all 5 Star Eater weapons had been destroyed, and the Drachnor's ultimate weapon was no more, and the Alliance fleet was routing the remaining enemy. Forces Admiral Hoffman transmitted congratulations to all teams and announced that this victory had turned the tide of the war, and that the Drachnor Empire was now in full retreat, and Kelly heard the cheers of the soldiers around her, but she felt only emptiness. They returned to Firebase Delta, and Kelly was treated as a hero, but she did not feel like one because Frank and 3 soldiers from the strike team had died, and she carried their memory like stones in her heart. Lyra found Kelly in the medical bay where she was being treated for minor injuries, and the princess embraced her and told her that the Alliance Council wanted to give her medals and honors. But Kelly said she did not want any of that. What Kelly wanted was to take Frank's body back to Earth, to the place he called Colorado, and bury him in the mountains he had told her about, and Admiral Hoffman personally approved this request and assigned a ship to take Kelly there. Kelly also requested that all slaves still held in Drachnor territory be liberated as a priority, and Hoffman agreed and said that rescue operations were already underway, and that thousands had already been freed. Over the next month the war continued, but the momentum had shifted, and without the Star Eater weapons, the Drachnor could not force the Alliance to surrender, and their empire began to fracture as subject worlds rebelled. Kelly traveled to Earth with Lyra and Ash and Ember, and they landed in Colorado, and Kelly hiked into the mountains with Frank's ashes and scattered them near a clear stream where pine trees grew tall and the air was crisp and cold. She stood there for a long time, remembering the stories Frank had told her about this place, and about fishing in the streams and camping under the stars, and she promised him that his sacrifice had not been in vain. Lyra stayed with Kelly for several weeks, and they traveled across Earth, visiting places that had been saved by their mission, and meeting families who thanked them with tears in their eyes. Eventually, Lyra had to return to Celestia because her people needed her, and she invited Kelly to come with her. But Kelly declined because she had decided to return to Lumina and see what remained of her homeworld before they parted. Lyra gave Kelly a communicator and told her that they were sisters now bound by blood and fire, and that she would always have a home on Celestia if she needed one. Kelly took Ash and Ember and boarded a transport heading toward the outer systems where Lumina was located, and as they traveled through space, she thought about everything that had happened since she first found those dragon eggs in the mines. When they finally reached Lumina, Kelly cried because the forests were still standing, and the rivers still ran clear, and she found survivors of her people who had hidden in the deep woods during the Drachnor occupation. They welcomed her home as a hero, and as the elf who had helped end the war, and they wanted to make her a leader. But Kelly said she was not ready for that, and that she needed time to heal. She built a small house near a waterfall where Ash and Ember could hunt and fly freely, and she spent her days helping to rebuild her people's villages and teaching the young ones about the galaxy beyond, their world. Sometimes at night, Kelly would stand on her porch and look up at the stars and think about Lyra and Frank and all the people she had met during her journey from slave to warrior, and she knew that her life had meaning because she had fought for something bigger than herself. The Draknor Empire eventually collapsed completely, and the Emperor was captured and tried for his crimes, and the Alliance established new protocols to prevent slavery and ensure that no species would suffer. As she had suffered, Kelly received messages from former slaves she had known in the mines, and they told her they were rebuilding their lives, and some of them came to visit her on Lumina, and they shared stories and memories and helped each other heal.